You were aging him like disrespectful.
They had the swoosh.
Mama said to be nice. You are not being nice today.
Him and Rantanen was there too.
Listen, that's wild. You talking about me being off the rails? You have just left the path. Okay, we're at Ohio State talking about football because they're the #1 team in the land once again in the newest college football playoff rankings that were released last night. Ohio State still coming for that #1 spot. Ryan Day is keeping it all in perspective when talking about his team. He says they know it means absolutely nothing. Their goal is to win the whole thing and be the #1 team at the end of the year. So the top 4 is unchanged. After the Buckeyes, you get the defending champion Georgia, then Michigan and Florida State, unfortunately, in the top 4. Unbeaten Washington remains on the outside looking in, sitting there at 5. Oregon, the first one-loss team, there at 6 amongst everyone else. Let's now bring in 24/7 Sports national college football writer Brad Crawford. And Brad, no shakeups at the top this week, even with Georgia getting a ranked win over Missouri compared to Ohio State's dub over Rutgers. Though you look at it and you see how it stands, the Buckeyes, do you feel fine with them sitting at #1 ahead of Georgia?
Zach, I thought there was a chance that Ohio State would slide to #2 after trailing Rutgers at halftime. But when you look at the Buckeyes' body of work, this team is still ahead of Georgia in several critical categories that are used by the selection committee. I'm talking about quality wins, top 25 wins, strength of schedule, game control. That being said, these next 2 games for Georgia could vault the Bulldogs to #1 prior to rivalry weekend. I will say, too, that Ohio State's win at Notre Dame in September is not as impressive as it looked a few weeks ago. That loss to a 4-4 Clemson team for the Fighting Irish did not help the Buckeyes' argument that previous win in South Bend was one of this season's best. So I'm okay right now with Ohio State at #1 and Georgia at #2.
Yeah, the opportunity for Georgia to truly impress the voters is coming up very fast, starting with Ole Miss this weekend. Ohio State having to wait until they face Michigan to end the season for their next ranked opponent. You look at that Ole Miss matchup, #9 team going to face Georgia, who is safely in the top 4, you can say right now. But let's play maybe devil's advocate here. Ole Miss, let's say they get the win. How much chaos would that bring if you have a one-loss SEC team in Ole Miss who probably won't get to play in the conference title game because that'll be Alabama? Where does that shake things up?
Yeah, we could potentially see a doomsday type scenario for the SEC. That Ole Miss-Georgia game Saturday night is going to mean infinitely more if Tennessee beats Missouri in that afternoon matchup, and here's why. That means a Rebels win in Athens creates an SEC East championship game scenario next weekend in Knoxville between the Vols and Bulldogs, with Tennessee needing to beat Georgia and then Vanderbilt to win the division. So Ole Miss winning in Athens ensures the Rebels will play in a New Year's Six game, a possible 11-1 finish for a second time under Lane Kiffin. And that basically, like I said, puts the SEC in a danger zone in terms of getting to the playoff. Because if a one-loss Georgia or Alabama wins the SEC, that league may not get in the Final Four if we have unbeaten champions from the Big Ten, ACC, and Pac-12. And then you have Texas sitting there at 12-1 with a win over Bama. So, yeah, Ole Miss, if they win this weekend to improve to 9-1, then 11-1 is coming and likely a spot in the Cotton or Orange Bowl for the Rebels.
Would Ole Miss have any type of argument to sneak their way into the final playoff 4?
I don't think so, man, because you would have to put Alabama or Georgia as the 12-1 SEC champion over Ole Miss, because Ole Miss lost Alabama in Tuscaloosa. They would have that win over Georgia in Athens, but you can't put a team that finishes essentially third in the SEC over the SEC champion. So I think best case scenario right now for Ole Miss is you win Saturday, you finish 11-1, and you get to a New Year's Six bowl game.
So it could be doomsday coming up for the SEC depending on how things play out on Saturday. Maybe a doomsday opportunity for the Big Ten coming up this weekend, because you look at Michigan and the way the conference is set up there, Wolverines will finally get to face a tough opponent in number 10 Penn State. But let's say the Big Ten wants representation in the CFP. How important is it that Michigan wins on Saturday?
Yeah, we're going to know by the end of this weekend if the possibility of a three-way tie in the Big Ten East is still out there. if Penn State beats the Wolverines, then that chain reaction scenario we're talking about could begin if Michigan beats Ohio State here in a couple weeks. Then you have Penn State likely 11-1, Michigan 11-1, and Ohio State 11-1. And I don't even want to begin to describe the 6 or 7 step tie-breaking scenario. So this is the first ranked opponent Michigan has played all season. So a lot of us media types and fans included are wondering, how is this team? Are they going to be as dominant as they've looked the first 10 weeks of the season? But I don't see a scenario in which the Big Ten, or any league for that matter, puts 2 teams in the playoffs. So like you mentioned, Michigan and Ohio State right now are the top options in the Big Ten. And if I'm a Big Ten homer right now, I'm hoping to see 2 unbeatens play Michigan-Ohio State here in a couple weeks.
Pac-12, meanwhile, on the other side, you look at Washington sitting at 5 on the outside, then Oregon right behind them. Both of those teams with some very tall tasks, Utah and USC, respectively. How on edge should the 2 programs be?
I think Washington has the tougher game this weekend because we're talking about the 2-time defending Pac-12 champion Utah Utes coming to Seattle in a underdog role, looking to spoil a season for Kalen DeBoer and Michael Penix and the Huskies. Utah has a way of uglying things up defensively. You see some of the scores this season from Utah games. There's been some low-scoring games, and I think the last 5 games Washington has played, they've all been within a single possession in the fourth quarter. So Washington's not beating teams like we saw early in the season, the last 4 or 5 weeks. Safe to say Washington is on upset alert at home. And then moving to Oregon, the one-loss Pac-12 elite, it's clear the selection committee putting the Ducks at 6 this week is fond of them. We know that if Oregon wins out with wins over USC on Saturday, Oregon State in 2 weeks, and then maybe a win over Washington in the league final, that's probably enough to warrant a Final Four bid. I think the Pac-12 right now sits in pretty good standing in this playoff race.
Yeah, so right now, I think it will be a very, very important weekend that could shake up a lot of things as we come down towards the closing stretch of the college football season. He's Brad Crawford getting us ready for the slate of games coming up as we look towards the CFP. And you look at the CFP when it comes to odds to win the national championship, and it's Michigan there with the shortest odds sitting at plus 230. Georgia right behind them at plus 250, and then a little bit of a gap following that. Alabama always finds a way to get a little bit of love. 8-1 odds for them to claim the title. So things certainly starting to heat up there in the CFP. I'm glad we have our guy Jerry Palm to make it all make sense and give us the 4-1-1 a little later in the show.
He'll give us that palm reading that we always love this time of year. But yesterday we had a tradition like no other as we get on Tuesdays. Lights, camera, Maction football returning back to our lives, injected into me in Ohio. Check this out. What? We had spin moves. Ball State doing their best. Meet me at the quarterback party. Then you got to get on the ball. Oh, and guess what? We got one more thing for you. A house call. Oh, yeah, the Maction is back, and we got all the highlights next.
You should put the Mac in you.